They threw me out at 11, called me a burden, then I became sole heir to Grandpa's $42 million estate. When I was 11, my parents looked me straight in the eye and told me I was nothing but a burden. My mother's voice was cold as winter steel when she said, "We can't keep wasting our lives on you, Matthew." My father didn't argue with her. Instead, he dragged a black trash bag from the hall closet, stuffed my clothes into it, and shoved it into my trembling arms. The last thing I heard before the door slammed was his words, "You'll figure it out. Or you won't. Either way, you're not our problem anymore." I stood on the cracked sidewalk of Maple Street with everything I owned sagging inside that bag. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. I didn't exist to them anymore. Neighbors peered from their curtains, whispering behind glass, but no one stepped forward. I was 11, hungry, terrified, and completely alone. Years crawled by like wounded animals. I survived on scraps from restaurant dumpsters, worked odd jobs that paid cash, and fought to build a life they swore I'd never have. I thought the worst was behind me. But then, 15 years later, I walked into my grandfather's funeral wearing a borrowed black suit that hung loose on my shoulders, only to see the same parents who abandoned me pull up in gleaming luxury vehicles, a silver Lexus and a midnight blue BMW. They stepped out laughing, their jewelry catching the afternoon light, acting like they owned the world. And when whispers spread through the funeral home that Grandpa had left behind a $42 million estate, they raised their voices and demanded their rightful share. Everyone turned toward the front of the room when the lawyer opened his leather portfolio. My heart hammered against my ribs as he scanned the faces of my family, then stopped on me. A small smile formed on his weathered lips as he read aloud, "The heir to everything is the one who kept my secret safe." Then he lifted his hand and pointed directly at me. After that night when my parents threw me out, life stopped being about childhood and started being about survival. At 11, while other kids were worried about homework or Saturday morning cartoons, I was standing on street corners trying to figure out where I would sleep without getting mugged or worse. The first week was the hardest. I carried that trash bag of clothes from block to block, too proud to beg, too scared to ask for help. Hunger gnawed at me so sharply that one night I crouched behind a pizza palace and waited for the manager to toss the garbage bags. I dug through them and pulled out half a pepperoni slice. That was my dinner. And I remember telling myself I'd never forget how it felt to be treated as less than human. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the October cold seeping through my thin jacket. It was the silence from the people who should have cared. My mother, Patricia, had always been more concerned with appearances than affection. She loved pristine houses, expensive perfume, and friends who praised her style. To her, children were accessories and I was a defective one. My father, Kenneth, was harder to read but sharper in his cruelty. He spoke like every word was a judgment handed down from on high. When I brought home grades that weren't perfect, he'd say, "A Montgomery should never be average." I never once heard him say he was proud of me. When they cast me out, they didn't just shut the door. They shut down any idea that family meant unconditional love. I had a younger sister, Emma. She was 9 when they made me leave. I still see her face pressed against the upstairs window as I walked down the driveway with that trash bag. She was crying, her small hand tapping against the glass like a trapped bird, but my parents pulled her away before she could wave goodbye. That image stayed with me through the darkest nights. Emma was the only person who looked at me like I mattered, but she was trapped in their world, forced to obey their cruel silence. There was only one person who tried to keep some thread of connection alive. My grandfather, William Montgomery. He was Kenneth's father, a man with a weathered face and a voice that carried both authority and kindness. William was not one for gentle words, but his actions spoke louder than anything. He ran a small chain of hardware stores and carried himself like a man who built his empire with his bare hands. Most people in town feared him, but I knew better. He didn't pity me, he respected the fight in me. Every few months when I was struggling the most, I would catch him watching me from a distance. Once he slipped me a folded $20 bill with a quick grunt, as if embarrassed to show affection, and said, "Don't waste it on junk." That was his way of caring. Despite the struggles, I found ways to survive. I worked odd jobs at gas stations, washed dishes at Danny's Diner, shoveled snow in the harsh Chicago winters, and mowed lawns in the sweltering summers. Each dollar felt like proof that I didn't need Patricia or Kenneth to exist. School was harder. Some nights I slept on park benches, other nights in homeless shelters, and still I showed up to Lincoln Elementary, then Roosevelt Middle School. Teachers noticed my unwashed clothes and tired eyes, but I lied and said everything was fine. Pride kept me from telling anyone the truth. By 13, I had learned how to blend into the background. I didn't complain, didn't ask for more than I earned, and I kept moving forward. I carried the sting of rejection inside me like a shard of glass, but it hardened into determination. When people told me I looked tired, I just smiled. When they asked where my parents were, I said they were busy. The truth was, they were too busy pretending I didn't exist. Through all of it, one memory kept me pushing forward. Before things got really bad, Grandpa William once told me, "The measure of a man isn't who stands with him when it's easy, Matthew. It's who he becomes when no one stands with him at all." I didn't fully understand it then, but those words became my compass. They reminded me that even though my parents had abandoned me, I had the chance to become something stronger. The years rolled by like storm clouds, and slowly I built a life out of nothing. At 16, I scraped together enough money to rent a tiny room above Murphy's hardware store. At 18, I was balancing 2 jobs while taking community college classes at night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I wasn't anyone's burden. I wasn't anyone's mistake. I was surviving, and survival felt like victory against impossible odds. Still, there was always a shadow lurking in the back of my mind. I wondered if Emma remembered me. I wondered if she ever asked about her big brother, or if Patricia and Kenneth had erased my name from the family completely. I wondered if Grandpa William had ever defended me when they spoke ill of me around the dinner table. The questions gnawed at me like persistent hunger, but I buried them under work and relentless focus. That's how life was for me before the phone call came. A cousin I barely remembered, Jake, reached out through social media and told me that Grandpa William had passed away. The funeral would be held at the family estate, the same place I hadn't stepped foot in since the night I was cast out like yesterday's garbage. I didn't have much: a borrowed black suit from my manager at the auto shop, shoes that pinched my feet, and a beat-up Honda Civic that coughed more than it ran. But I knew I had to be there. For the first time in years, I would face the people who once abandoned me without a second thought. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would no longer walk into their world as the boy they threw away. I was coming as the man I had fought tooth and nail to become. The morning of the funeral felt heavy from the moment I opened my eyes in that cramped apartment above the hardware store. My chest tightened as I buttoned the collar of a borrowed white shirt that didn't quite fit around my neck. I studied myself in the cracked mirror hanging on my bathroom wall. The man staring back at me looked tired, older than his 26 years, but his eyes carried something my parents had never recognized or respected: resolve. This wasn't just about saying goodbye to my grandfather. This was about walking back into a world that had once thrown me to the curb like trash and showing them that I had not only survived, I had thrived. When I pulled up to the Montgomery estate on Riverside Drive, the circular driveway was lined with polished luxury cars, each one shining as though it had just rolled off the showroom floor. Mercedes-Benz sedans, BMW SUVs, a pristine white Cadillac Escalade near the front entrance. I parked my sputtering Honda at the far end of the street, out of sight of the main gate, and walked up the cobblestone path that led to the imposing front doors. Guests in expensive black suits and glittering jewelry swept past me without recognition. They didn't know who I was, or if they did, they pretended not to notice the scrawny kid who used to live here. I stepped inside the house I hadn't seen since childhood, and the smell of polished mahogany and expensive cologne hit me like a wave of memories. I could see myself as a boy running through those same marble-floored halls, Emma's laughter echoing behind me as we played hide and seek. Now the laughter was gone, replaced with hushed whispers and the somber sound of classical music playing near the main reception room. At the center of it all was my grandfather's mahogany casket, draped in dark velvet with a simple photograph resting on top. Even in that picture he looked stern and uncompromising, but to me he looked like the only person who had ever believed I was worth something more than the sum of my mistakes. Then I saw them. My mother and father entered from the far side of the room, their presence commanding attention like actors taking center stage. Patricia wore an elegant black dress with pearls around her neck, her expression perfectly calculated sorrow. Kenneth followed close behind, his posture military straight, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, his cold eyes scanning the room like a general assessing his troops. Behind them was my Uncle Raymond, broad-shouldered and loud even in his funeral silence, his smirk betraying the greed already churning in his calculating mind. They spotted me almost instantly. Patricia's perfectly lipsticked mouth tightened as if she had tasted something bitter and spoiled. She leaned toward Kenneth and muttered something I couldn't hear, but his response came sharp and clear enough to cut glass. "He shouldn't even be here." His words weren't directed at me, but they cut deep as if they were. I walked toward the casket with measured steps, ignoring the stares burning into my back like laser beams. When I reached it, I placed my calloused hand on the polished wood. For a moment, it was just me and him, the grandfather who never forgot me. "Thank you for never giving up on me," I whispered under my breath, my voice barely audible above the classical music. As I turned away from the casket, Emma appeared at the edge of the crowd. She was 24 now, grown into the beautiful young woman I had only imagined she would become during those lonely years. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and for a heartbeat I saw the same little sister who had pressed her hand against the window glass the night I left. She didn't come closer though. My parents' intimidating presence kept her frozen in place like a deer in headlights. Her silence was deafening, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know. I had been missed. I had been remembered. The ceremony began with all the traditional pomp and circumstance. Pastor Williams spoke about Williams' incredible work ethic, his business accomplishments, his lasting legacy in the community. I listened politely, but my focus drifted to the rows of expectant faces surrounding me. Each person waiting for what would come next. Not the prayers, not the heartfelt eulogies about a man they barely knew. Everyone was waiting for the reading of the will. When the service ended with a final hymn, the lawyer, Mr. Harrison, stepped forward to address the crowd. He was a distinguished man with graying hair at his temples, his black suit pressed to perfection, his movements precise and deliberate. He carried a thick leather portfolio in his weathered hands, and the entire room shifted like tectonic plates. Conversations quieted to whispers. Even the air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment that would determine who walked away with William Montgomery's vast fortune and who walked away with nothing but bitter disappointment. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat with authority. As executor of William Montgomery's estate, I will now read the provisions of his last will and testament. His voice carried the weight of decades in courtrooms, and every head in the room turned toward him like sunflowers following the sun. My Uncle Raymond leaned back in his leather chair with a confident grin spreading across his face. Finally, he muttered under his breath, rubbing his hands together. Kenneth straightened his silk tie and checked his expensive watch. Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief she didn't need, putting on a performance worthy of Broadway. Emma sat frozen between our parents, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I stayed near the back of the room, my sweaty palms pressed against my thighs, pretending I wasn't trembling inside like a leaf in a hurricane. The lawyer began methodically listing smaller bequests, donations to local charities, gifts to longtime employees at the hardware stores, modest properties given to distant relatives I'd never met. The tension in the room grew thicker with each line he read, like smoke filling a closed space. Everyone was waiting for the final announcement, the massive fortune that would define the Montgomery name for generations to come. Finally, Mr. Harrison paused dramatically. He shuffled through the papers with deliberate slowness, and his experienced eyes swept across the room like a searchlight. As for the majority of my estate, he read, his tone measured and precise, $42 million in liquid assets, business holdings and real estate properties, I leave it all to one person and one person only. Patricia leaned forward so far she nearly fell off her chair. Kenneth's jaw muscles tightened like steel cables. Raymond's smirk widened into something predatory. Emma's nervous eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for escape. Mr. Harrison continued reading in his steady baritone, "The heir to everything will not be the one who demanded the most, nor the one who carries my name the loudest with empty pride. The heir will be the one who kept my secret safe through years of hardship and never once betrayed my trust." Confusion rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Raymond frowned deeply, his confident expression cracking. Kenneth snapped his head toward the lawyer with laser focus. Patricia whispered sharply, "What the hell does that mean?" Her composure finally slipping. Mr. Harrison closed the leather portfolio with deliberate care, then looked up from the papers. His gaze swept methodically over the room once more, passing over Patricia's shocked face, Kenneth's clenched jaw, Raymond's growing panic and Emma's wide, innocent eyes. Then his eyes landed directly on me, sitting quietly in the back row like I didn't belong. He smiled, subtle but unmistakable, and slowly raised his weathered hand. With steady precision he pointed his finger directly at my chest. The room erupted like a volcano. Gasps echoed off the high ceilings. Kenneth shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward. "This is a mistake," he barked, his face turning red with rage. "This is absolutely impossible." Patricia clutched her pearls with white knuckles, shaking her perfectly styled head furiously. "No, no, no. This cannot be happening." Raymond slammed his fist against the arm of his chair hard enough to leave a mark. Every eye in that funeral parlor turned toward me like spotlights. My chest felt tight, my pulse roared in my ears like ocean waves, but I didn't flinch or shrink back into my chair. For the first time in 15 long years, I wasn't the unwanted boy they had thrown away like garbage. I was the one who held the key to a secret none of them understood or could even imagine. The room erupted in chaos after the lawyer pointed at me with certainty. My father's voice cut through the noise first, sharp and furious as a blade. This is absolutely absurd. That boy hasn't been part of this family for over a decade. How could he possibly be the heir to anything? My uncle Raymond joined the attack, his tone mocking and cruel. Come on, Harrison. Don't play games with us. Everyone in this room knows William would never hand over $42 million to a castaway, a nobody. My mother's face twisted with pure fury and disbelief. She clutched my father's arm with desperation and hissed, "Kenneth, you stop this nonsense right now." Her voice trembled, not with grief for her father-in-law, but with raw fear of losing what she believed was rightfully hers. The lawyer remained calm as a lake, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses before responding. "Mr. Montgomery, this was your father's explicit wish, written in his own hand. The will is crystal clear and legally binding. The one who inherits is the one who kept his most precious secret safe." Then, looking directly at me again with knowing eyes, he asked the question that changed everything. "Matthew, do you still have the wooden box your grandfather gave you all those years ago?" More gasps circled the room like wildfire. My father's face went pale, then flushed red with rage, but the words froze me in place like I'd been struck by lightning. For a moment, that funeral parlor seemed to vanish completely, and I was transported back to a freezing alley 15 years earlier. I was 12, huddled beneath a rusted fire escape behind Tony's Pizza, my breath visible in the bitter December air. My stomach ached from 3 days without a real meal, my hands raw and bleeding from the cold. That night, I had nearly given up completely, nearly convinced myself that I would never survive to see my next birthday. Then I heard footsteps echoing against the brick walls of the alley. "Boy," a familiar voice called through the darkness. I looked up with hope and saw him, Grandpa William, wrapped in his heavy winter coat, standing taller and more imposing than I had seen him in months. His weathered eyes studied me with a mixture of disappointment and something deeper, something that looked like fierce pride. "You're tougher than they'll ever give you credit for," he said, his voice carrying through the cold night air. He knelt down in front of me, his rough but steady hands placing a wooden box in my frozen lap. The box was about the size of a shoebox, worn smooth at the corners, its brass lock gleaming faintly under the distant streetlight. "Inside this box is something worth more than all the money in the world," he told me with absolute seriousness. "You must not open it until the time is right, Matthew. Promise me, guard this with your life. If you keep this safe, then one day you'll understand why I chose you over all of them." I stared at him through chattering teeth, shivering and too weak to argue. "Why me, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His answer was simple but powerful, "Because you are the only one I trust completely. They want what I have built, but you've never wanted anything from me except love and acceptance. That makes you stronger than all of them combined." I nodded with all the determination my 12-year-old heart could muster, clutching the mysterious box with both frozen hands. "I promise, Grandpa. I'll keep it safe no matter what." For 15 long years I carried that box everywhere like a sacred trust. It moved with me from shelter to shelter, from rundown rooms to cheap apartments across 3 different states. There were desperate nights when I thought of pawning it just to buy food, just to survive another day. But the promise held me back every single time. Each moment I looked at that worn wooden box, I remembered the weight of William's words and the trust he had placed in me. Keeping the box safe became my anchor, the absolute proof that even when the world turned its back on me, someone believed I was worth trusting. The memory faded like morning mist, and I was back in that funeral parlor, all eyes locked on me with laser intensity. Slowly, deliberately, I reached under my metal folding chair where I had hidden my worn canvas bag. From inside, I carefully pulled out the same wooden box, still intact after all those difficult years. The brass lock shone under the chandelier light like a beacon. Gasps filled the air again, louder and more shocked this time. My father lunged forward desperately. "That doesn't prove anything at all. He could have stolen it from the old man." Mr. Harrison raised his hand for silence. "No, Kenneth. Your father documented everything meticulously. He entrusted this box to Matthew personally. He told me himself that the contents would reveal who truly honored his final wish and kept their sacred promise." Patricia's voice cracked like breaking glass. "This is complete madness. We raised him. We sacrificed everything for him and he abandoned us. How dare you reward betrayal?" I looked directly at her, and for the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel small or ashamed under her withering gaze. My voice was steady and strong when I replied, "You didn't sacrifice anything for me, Patricia. You threw me away because I wasn't convenient anymore. Grandpa was the only one who treated me like I actually mattered. I made him a promise and I kept it through 15 years of hell." The room went silent as a tomb. My Uncle Raymond folded his arms across his chest, his face twisted with resentment. Emma shifted uncomfortably, her eyes moving between me and our parents, her lips pressed tight as if holding back words she desperately wanted to speak but didn't dare. Mr. Harrison stepped closer with reverence. "Matthew, do you wish to open it now and reveal the truth?" I looked at the box that had been my burden and my hope. "Yes," I said firmly. "It's time for everyone to know the truth.